So, Ian, to get the ball rolling, at the IMF, you've increasingly focused also on this issue in terms of global macroeconomics. But one thing that is part of that is the distributional effects that it may lead to, of course, not nationally also, but also internationally. And maybe you can say a few words on that, because it's part of the difficulties reaching an overall path which the world, more or less as a whole, can kind of coalesce around.
Right. I mean, we emphasize that when countries are trying to move ahead with carbon pricing, they should emphasize the opportunities, the potential revenues, which we would put at about 1 to 3% of GDP for the typical G20 country, moving with phasing in carbon prices around $70 per ton by 2030. So that creates a large amount of revenue. Much of that can be used for growth-enhancing measures, like cutting taxes on labor and capital, or funding spending, productive spending like infrastructure. But it's also important to address the sensitivities, the impacts on vulnerable groups. Here we've been looking at the incidence within a country of carbon pricing, and our analysis suggests, for example, that in the United States and in China, that carbon pricing would be moderately regressive, meaning that it imposes a slightly higher burden relative to consumption for lower-income households than higher-income households. But we find the opposite in India. And another important statistic is, well, you really want it. We emphasize that holding down energy prices below their efficient levels, and efficient means not only covering production costs, but also environmental costs, air pollution costs, and climate costs. That's a terribly inefficient way to help low-income households, because the huge bulk of the benefits, typically 90% or more, accrue to higher-income groups. But as you do reform energy prices, as you phase in carbon pricing, you do want to help below-income households. And typically, at least in the early phases, we estimate that you'll need about, say, 8 to 12% of the carbon pricing revenues to compensate the low-income groups.
And internationally?
Well, there's this argument about, shouldn't the advanced countries take the main burden of mitigation? And clearly there are arguments for that, but we still think it's very important for emerging market economies to be pricing emissions. For one thing, 195 countries have made, well, maybe it's 194 now, but there's a large number of countries have made these mitigation commitments, and they want to meet these commitments at lowest cost burden on the economy, and the best way to do that is to have carbon pricing as the centerpiece. For a lot of emerging market economies, they simply can't raise sufficient revenues from broader fiscal instruments because of such a high concentration of economic activity occurring in the informal sector. So from a fiscal perspective, it does make some sense for them to include carbon pricing as part of their broader fiscal system. And then in addition, for some countries like India and China, there are very large domestic environmental benefits from moving ahead with carbon pricing. We estimate that if China phased in a $70 per ton carbon price between now and 2030, that would save about 4 million lives over this period due to less exposure to local air pollution. So for a lot of these countries, it's actually in their own interests to impose some level of carbon pricing because of the domestic environmental benefits and possibly the fiscal benefits, before even counting the global climate change benefits. So when we're discussing equity issues and burdens on different countries, we emphasize it's very important not just to look at the pure economic costs of mitigation, but to subtract off the domestic environmental benefits and also other fiscal benefits as well.
Thank you. Adel, and the U.S. in all of this now, the big question, one of the very big questions. What are the 2 or 3 points that you would perhaps like to make in that context?
Well, thank you, Kamal. And first of all, thank you so much for chairing this event. I'm just delighted at your leadership on this topic within Brookings and more broadly. And I want to thank Nick and Joe for their leadership on our not so easily managed commission. I think you guys have done an amazing job, and in part due to the terrific support from the folks at the World Bank. So thank you, John Room and your team for all their hard work. So far, the Trump administration has not yet invited me to come brief them on my views as to what the U.S. ought to do. So I might as well just brief you, since you're sitting here and you all look so bright, and I'm sure you have a straight conduit to the White House inner sanctum. So you can take advantage of my thoughts as you see fit. I have two pieces of advice to the Trump administration and to Congress. Number one, stay in the Paris Agreement. I think that there's, the U.S., I strongly agree with Secretary Tillerson. The U.S. needs a seat at the table. There's no substitute for U.S. leadership and participation, not just in that multilateral fora, but in the G20 and the other multilateral discussions that include all sorts of economic and national security matters. Of which climate is an important element. The other thing I would say is put a price on carbon. The topic of our event today is carbon pricing in the future of global climate cooperation. I could say carbon pricing is the future of global climate cooperation in many ways. And I would love to see the administration take an extraordinary opportunity to set the climate agenda for this country for decades to come. I think it's an extraordinary opportunity. And I'll tell you a couple reasons why, like economically why and politically why, and then how I think they can do it, okay? So you can decide if you believe me. So let's start with the politics, because we understand this is a very changed political environment in the United States. So why would it be in the interest of the Trump administration and the Republican Congress to work with Democrats on this topic? And I would say, number one, obfuscating and dissembling on climate science is a losing strategy. It's a losing strategy for sure in the long run. I think increasingly it's a losing strategy in the short to medium run politically. I think we see that in terms of the views of young Republicans and the views of moderates, centrists, independent voters, and increasingly Republican voters as well. I don't think the Trump administration is going to be able to deliver on the promises it has placed with regard to the outcomes of environmental deregulation. Okay, you kill the Clean Power Plan, change up the methane rules, walk back from some of the Obama era regulatory programs, you're not going to bring back coal production in Appalachia. We just look at the data, look at the forecasts. I've run these models. It's not going to happen. So how are you going to deliver on a better future to coal workers and their communities? I'm going to get to that. I have the perfect answer for you. I think it's an opportunity to show you can make a deal and have a success and work across the aisle and really truly address one of the most critical problems facing humanity and be a global leader, be seen to be the global leader that the Trump administration can be if they choose. I think, this is an opportunity in the palm of their hands. And at the same time, accomplish other goals. If you want to work the carbon excise tax or call it a fee, whatever you want to call it, fine with me, as a pay-for into corporate income tax reform or some other broader pro-growth tax reform, great. You want to do a standalone fee and dividend bill, great. But you can accomplish those other goals while still serving the environment. And I think that, so those are a few political ideas. Let me give you the economic rationale for U.S. leadership in carbon pricing. First of all, being the biggest market economy on the face of the earth, having the deepest, most liquid, most dynamic, most efficient capital markets on the face of the earth. We have capital ready to be deployed in the R&D and the technological. We can be the engine of innovation, but we have to have the profit motive harnessed appropriately. And that's what you get when you price carbon, if you do it responsibly. We've got the scale, and I really believe that one of the most important conceptual framing of how we price carbon in the United States is how do we create the perfect crucible for forging the technologies that will then be adopted by countries with less means than the United States. And those positive environmental spillovers could swamp whatever we manage to accomplish domestically in terms of emissions abatement. So, okay, what would that package look like? So I think we need the carbon price, again, put it in tax reform. I think we need to be mindful of the effects of those disproportionately burdened. And Ian talked about that, and I think that's true in the United States as well. Many of our social safety net programs are price indexed. So to some extent, those who subsist on transfer income will be a little bit buffered, but we still need to be mindful about low to moderate income households that would have some real new net burden from a carbon tax. And I'm going to come back to the coal workers. Just a tiny slice of a reasonable carbon tax could be transformative in coal country and underwrite the pension and medical benefits of coal workers and retirees in the industry. It could fund reclamation of disturbed and impaired lands and waterways as a result of coal mining. We could invest in infrastructure. We could invest in the education and the brighter future for people who live in coal country and whose generations have depended on the industry. And so those folks could be made better off than they would be even without climate policy, right? So you do this right, you've got so many opportunities for leadership, environmental effectiveness, and pro-growth tax reform. I mean, what's not to love about a positive agenda that way?
Thank you very much. Joe or Nick, would you like to react very briefly to either one of the, or just say we agree?
I agree with them, and I could say put this in just for a minute into broader optimal tax theory. Optimal tax theory always took into account, when it's done right, distribution effects, and so you can think about it in those terms. And the taxes that you would impose would be sensitive both to the distribution effects and how you could undo those distribution effects. And so, as Adele pointed out, if you have welfare support programs that actually compensate them, then in some sense, it's more complicated than that in the sense that in certain parts of the country, for instance, those effects will be larger than others, and we don't have sensitive programs that pick that up. But if that were found to be significant, we could obviously deal with that problem. That it's used as an excuse. It's not really a legitimate reason not to go ahead.
But isn't one other reason that the U.S. is questioning is the country distribution of the commitments? I mean, international commitments.
I think the concern that, China's not doing anything, therefore why should we? I think that's mostly BS. It's a smokescreen for not doing anything. And in fact, China is doing stuff.
Yeah, I mean, Nick and I spend a lot of time in China, and I think both of us would say they're actually very committed to it. And when they, the new development bank that they are one of the 5 members and is committed to, the whole focus is on climate change.
What about India?
Well, India has now a tax on coal. And this is sort of, people don't realize it. We have a little tax on coal. It funds our Black Lung Liability Trust Fund. And so when India adopted a small comparable tax on coal, after hectoring the Indians for years to do something about climate, they finally adopted tax on coal, and the U.S. doesn't say anything. That's sort of, I think, unfortunate. And then they raised it, and they're raising it again. So little by little by little, I think the Indians have come to realize, number one, they have a terrible air quality problem it's not just a human health issue, it's a political issue. And I would say that's true in a number of developing countries, not just India. And I think that we should be developing international dialogues and fora to talk about these policies and reward and applaud each other when we do make progress, exchange ideas and techniques and administrative tools, and develop methodologies and agreed reporting standards and monitoring approaches around carbon pricing per se. And I think that's another great area of ripe for leadership, whether it's the Trump administration or those in the carbon pricing leadership area. There are a number of really promising areas of international cooperation and coordination.
But it's true that at the moment, the pledges are kind of all over the place. Effectively, some countries have to cut emissions below business as usual in 2030 by 40%. Others don't have to do much, maybe cut emissions by 10%. According to our very rough estimates, just based on plausible assumptions about fuel price responses, if G20 countries were to phase in a $70 per ton carbon price by 2030, then a bunch of countries would easily meet their mitigation commitments, Indonesia, China, India, South Africa, and so on. Some other countries would just about or slightly fall short of their commitments, United States, Japan, Germany, whereas others, poor old Australia and Canada, would fall well short of what's needed. So, at the moment, there is a wide range of implicit or explicit carbon prices implied by the commitments. But the idea is that countries will be revising these commitments over time, and presumably there'll be a lot more pressure on countries for whom it's relatively easy to meet their pledges to ramp up their commitments relative to those that are really struggling to meet their commitments. I would imagine over time.
Just to clarify, when you said 20, you meant CO2e, right? So when we talk carbon prices, it's carbon dioxide equivalent.
Yeah.
Okay. Because it's something that
Yeah.
when numbers appear
Yeah.
can create confusion.
Yeah.
Could I add a little to what was said about China and India? Because I think it helps understand both about why Paris happened and where we might go. But your first question, can I say something briefly about what Ian and Adele said? Yes, I agree, and I thought it was elegant and convincing. So what about China and India? China peaked coal probably 2014, coal use. And China may well have already peaked emissions. They promised to do it by 2030. I'm in print forecasting they'd do it in the early 2020s. I think that probably was a bit too late. I think it will be before 2020. That's a measure of how fast they've changed and how they're over-delivering on Paris commitments. It's a Chinese characteristic in planning, is that you don't commit until unless you think you can really do it, which is not a perspective on targets which everybody has. But and China are doing it for reasons that are going to stay. They're deeply worried about climate change. For millennia, water has been a big issue in China. The water comes mostly from the Himalayas. They're a coastal population. They're very vulnerable to sea surges, salinization, sea level rise. So they really worry about climate change, and the Politburo is full of people who have serious science degrees. Again, distinguishing them from other kinds of cabinets. But there are other aspects of Chinese polity which we could discuss too, but I'm just making those as observations. Certainly pollution was a very big part of China's story, but also they feel that they, in this new race in technology, to get cleaner technologies, build better infrastructure, more efficient infrastructure, they think they can be rather good at that, and there's some evidence that they are. So these are reasons that are not going to go away. Chinese commitment is clear and strong and will continue. And India, China really changed around 2010, and it was 2009-10, it was built into the 12th five-year plan, built into the 13th, and it'll be built into the next one too. And those, of course, are legally binding. They become law in China. India, the change, I've been working in China for 30 years, India for more than 40 years. The change in India in the last 3 or 4 years has been remarkable. And again, it helps understand Paris and why developing countries, emerging market countries, were ready to make commitments in Paris. Finally, the pollution in Indian cities has become a political issue. Far, far too late, since around half of the worst polluted cities, say the top or bottom 25, depending where you look at it, are in India, and Delhi's the worst. So that really has become a political issue. It's published in, pollution is published in the vernacular press. You can see it now on displayed in various parts of Delhi. It's really becoming political. Second, the cost of solar in competitive auctions in India has dramatically reduced, and it's competing coal away. And latest energy assessments as made by the government of India indicate that they are unlikely to need all of the coal power under construction already. We'll have to see how that develops. But that's been a remarkable change. So it's been a combination of pollution and the opportunities that they now see to do things differently. So the drivers in China, I think, are now kicking in quite strongly in India. And of course, the same will be true of many other parts of the world. And remember, in my own country, the UK, we kill 30 to 40,000 a year from air pollution. 1 in 2,000 of our population, at least 10 times, perhaps 15 times more deaths than through traffic accidents. So when we talk about India and China, we shouldn't think that those are the only places that suffer from air pollution and where these arguments are strong.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we'll turn to the audience now, take a few questions rather than one by one. Starting with you. Just identify yourself, please, before when you ask your question. And I won't go directly back to the panel, but collect a few questions. And please make it questions rather than...
I'm Mitzi Wertheim with the Naval Postgraduate School. I guess I have 2 questions. What do you do about people who become unemployed because of this major social change? And how are you going to educate the general public in what I consider a clear, concise, compelling story, not for the educated, but for those who don't focus in on this? And unless you make it something, oh my God, we have to do something about this, it's going to take a long time.
Thank you. There was a gentleman in the middle there somewhere, I think with the beard, yeah, there.
Hi, Don Kraus with Citizens Climate Lobby. I just, if any of the panel members could discuss the benefits of or problems inherent with border adjustment tariffs or fees between countries that are pricing carbon or are not pricing carbon. Thank you.
Yeah, while the microphone is over there.
Thanks. I'm Ben Schlesinger. Adele, it's good to see you. I'm basically a natural gas expert, so I don't know. We're part of the solution, I guess, and as much we're replacing coal or not, that's a different matter. So to your point, Adele, it's maybe more than money. I've spent some time in coal country, and it's effectively invalidating a way of life by stopping coal. We all know the one thing you can do for coal in this country, it's to ban fracking, and coal will fly in as a result, and usage would increase. That's, of course, not going to happen under this or any other administration. So, coal has been marketed out, and it invalidates them. Like, Daddy did this, my daddy's daddy did this, and all that. So I think that's something you have to deal with. And the lady who asked about bringing in, explaining this and bringing buy-in to people who are not highly educated as we all are, but people who, simply have their views based on their way of life.
Okay. Yes?
Rahul Tongia with Brookings India. We heard about distribution and variance and carbon pricing, and short of a global market, which would eventually, as you said, get to one price, we may have different numbers in different places, and we in fact have different numbers, many zero, but many non-zero in different parts of the world. How do you see that playing out? Because is it not something that comes back to bite you politically or economically in terms of comparative advantage? How do you see that evolving? Because yes, we need much higher numbers, as you've alluded, to actually get closer to the 2 degrees or 1.5. But those who take that step are putting themselves out there.
Okay, maybe there's one more there. Yeah. Then we'll take another round.
Len Berman. Joe, I was surprised when you said that you thought we needed to emphasize that it was carbon pricing and regulation. Adele and Aparna Mathur have argued that one of the appealing things politically in the U.S. is that you can substitute inefficient regulation with much more efficient carbon pricing. And I'm not really optimistic that even if there is an optimal regulation scheme that would work, that we could ever get there given the way we actually do regulations in the U.S.
Okay. Well, maybe we'll take one more because of the timing, and then we'll have a last round on the panel.
A rather basic question. Brookings naturally is an economics institute, and so the emphasis is on price, and then we'll see how the world responds in terms of the actual carbon reduction. The other way, I took Economics 101 several decades ago, and the other part of the curve is you got the two curves that you all know from Economics 101. The other curve is the supply or the quantity. That an alternative approach could well be to put requirements that absolutely demand reductions in carbon use in various everything, home, industry, utilities, and then see how the world responds to what price is really required to achieve those things. Otherwise, we're guessing one way. The other way, we'll be open and find a surprise.
All right. I think we'll take the last round now. Maybe starting with Adele and then ending with Nick.
Sure.
And please don't feel you have to address every question, but particularly those who concern what you said.
Well, let me take something that I've actually given a lot of thought to and I'm doing research on right now, and that's the issue of competitiveness and trade distortions that can result from disparate carbon pricing. So, at least in the United States, I think there are at least 5 things we can do to ameliorate concerns about competitiveness. But first, let's put it into context. The actual amount of economic activity that would be displaced or the emissions that would be driven abroad as a result of a unilateral carbon price in the United States is very small. I mean, obviously it depends on what that price is and exactly how unilateral it is and what time frame you're looking at. But the fact is the vast majority of American activity, economic activity, is not going to be displaced as a result of a price on carbon. But to the extent people are worried about it, and I know this is important, especially in energy-intensive, trade-exposed industries, there are at least 5 things we can do, and some of which might clash a little bit from what Nick and Joe said. First, I think we can start our carbon price modestly. It needs to be environmentally responsible. It needs to be credible. It needs to be effective. But I'm pretty convinced that starting out of the gate with a very high carbon price would scrap capital, it would galvanize opposition, and probably be politically unstable. So my own view is in the United States, we should probably start a little more modestly and ramp up over inflation and give everybody time to adjust politically and in their capital stock and households and corporations alike. I think we can, in the United States, very specifically supplant a future of regulation under the Clean Air Act of greenhouse gases with a price on carbon. And we can do that environmentally responsibly because those regulations will take decades to promulgate, and they're going to take an unceasing series of Democrats in the White House that we've already seen the vulnerability of that regulatory authority to a political shift. So I think we're not giving up much, frankly, if we suspend the rulemaking process in favor of a price on carbon. Third, we can use that carbon tax to fund pro-growth tax reform that makes the whole U.S. more competitive. If you make the U.S. more attractive to capital and investment and saving, that can only be a good thing for U.S. competitiveness. Fourth, I mentioned the diplomatic advantages of a carbon tax as opposed to many other climate policies. I don't know that other countries really knew what Section 111D of the Clean Air Act was and what it was going to produce. California, God love them, have no standing under the Framework Convention on Climate Change. They can't make commitments on the part of the United States government in a sub-federal jurisdiction. So there's clear diplomatic advantages, and we should leverage that. And because that competitiveness issue is very much directly dependent on what other countries do. And finally, I think for those industries that are very energy intensive and very trade exposed, and for whom the competitiveness issue is salient and immediate, even with a modest starting price, you can have a carefully circumscribed border carbon adjustment, and I believe such a policy can be made to be consistent with WTO obligations. So, with those 5 strategies, I think we're good to go, and concerns about competitiveness are not a reason not to do anything.
Thank you. Ian?
Yeah, just starting with this issue of, won't a wide range of carbon prices emerge in different countries given different stringency of commitments and the difference in the emissions to responsiveness to pricing. Emissions are a lot more responsive to pricing in coal-intensive countries than countries that don't have coal. And we think it's time that policymakers considered the possibility of complementing the Paris process with a carbon price floor arrangement, particularly among the large emitting countries. So they would agree to impose a minimum carbon price and gradually ramp it up over time as a complement and to reinforce other efforts to meet their mitigation pledges. I mean, this seems to us a good way to go because it provides some degree of assurance against competitiveness impacts. It allows individual countries the flexibility to set prices higher than the floor price, which they may want to do so if they're concerned about the fiscal revenues from carbon pricing, or they like the large domestic environmental benefits from carbon pricing. Or maybe it's Sweden, where it's politically more acceptable to have a stiffer carbon price than in other countries. And that's the way we've handled under taxation at an international level in other contexts. For example, in the European Union, we don't force all countries to have the same value-added tax or the same tax on tobacco, alcohol, and energy products. We have minimum tax floors, but countries have the flexibility to set tax rates higher than the floor tax. So we think that's an arrangement that policymakers should be discussing now as a complement to the Paris process. The complication is that you would need to account for, maybe some countries don't fully price all emissions. Maybe they have some exemptions, or maybe at the same time they're adjusting pre-existing fuel taxes, so that can enhance or offset the effects on emissions. But we think it's all analytically quite practical to come up with procedures for taking those other factors into account. And then on this issue of pricing versus regulation, I mean, yes, if the only problem you're trying to address is a pure emissions externality, then it's always more cost-effective to use a pricing instrument rather than combining a pricing instrument with a set of regulations. But for political reasons, maybe the needed pricing is perhaps politically too difficult in a particular country. So that's one reason why you may need to have a mix of strategies. And then, as we've discussed, the other reason is that there are a range of other market failures that you're simultaneously trying to address, particularly technology-related market failures. So you want some complementary measures to be promoting more R&D into emission-saving technologies and perhaps promoting their deployment as well.
Joe?
Okay. So first, I want to address a couple questions about how you deal with the employed and the fact that there are always going to be shocks to our economy and that force some people from one sector to another. What is very clear is that market economies don't handle that very well, and for good reason. The sectors that have been adversely shocked, they lose their physical capital, they lose their human capital, and that's why efficient government policy has some kind of program, not only to provide, you might say, social protection, for at least the younger people, help them move into a more productive uses. And so that kind of industrial policy is really, I think, an important part, not just in this area, but in every area. And this happens to be a very important area where it's going to be very big, but I think we'll have to address that. The general principle in taxation that it's always better to tax bad things than good things is really illustrated by the advantage of a carbon tax. And but the other side, when you design optimal taxation, you have to design optimal taxation with awareness of all the market failures and all the distributive consequences. And that really fits into exactly what you're saying. It could turn out to be that the price that you might have to charge to elicit the responses that you need could be very high. There are all kinds of behavioral impediments, and behavioral economics has shown people don't act necessarily rationally. And if you had very large changes in very large taxes, it could be the case that to offset that, you would need to have large redistributions. And the question is, would those be acceptable, and would you be able to do that effectively? So it may be that the optimal policy mix includes an awareness of these and combining them together. The same thing, we've known, since the work of, say, Marty Weitzman, in a second best world, there are uncertainties associated. There's instrument uncertainty. When we don't know the consequences, it's not always clear whether price or quantity regulation is better. And and that goes back to the general framework that both Nick and I emphasize. It's dynamic public economics. You learn. And the question is, what is the best way to learn? And I think that's something that we can should all agree on. So finally, let me answer the question about comparative advantage, and there is going to be some distortion. If you don't have the same price, there's going to be some distortion. But there are all kinds of these distortions, and the real question is both the magnitude and how we learn to live with it. And I think Adele made a very forceful argument, is for most of these, it won't be the dominant effect. But it is an argument for why, if the United States just walked off, that would be a problem. And Adele talked about it from the point of view of the United States. Now, you flip that reasoning abroad, everybody abroad seeing the United States not participating, they would have responses. And among their responses would be to say, we can't allow this as part of the international community. What are the instruments that we have? And they would think about alternative instruments. Among the instruments would be a border adjustment tax. And it would be hard to believe that that would not be one that people would not think about. So it seems to me that that is part of the background as people are thinking about responding, and hopefully it keeps us working together. The main motive should be that it's in all of our interest. It's the cooperative spirit. And it's unfortunate that one country has announced that it's not thinking about things cooperatively, but in a non-cooperative spirit. And hopefully the others will put that aside and continue to act in what you might call a cooperative game, and in that spirit. But the alternative framework is a possibility.
Nick, some last word?
Yes. I won't try all of them, but just a few of the questions. Good industrial policy, and we now in the UK have a department for business, energy and industrial strategy. Good industrial policy promotes and facilitates change. It's not there to prevent change. And I think that's an important guiding principle wherever you look, including in coal. I mean, I haven't checked the numbers, but I think the US has lost about 500,000 jobs in retail this century, and probably more than are at stake in the coal, many more than at stake in the coal sector. How do you manage that? It's a similar kind of question. When you talk about coal or shipbuilding in the UK, it was an earlier example, those things have a special feature of place, that they're concentrated in one place. Sometimes that facilitates policy, and I thought Adele gave a very convincing set of policies that could handle what happens, or do your best to manage, I'd say, what happens when your losses occur in one place. But it's about managing and facilitating technical change in a competitive world. And that's the way to keep up employment and to keep up productivity. On prices and regulation, it's not true that prices are always efficient in a world, more efficient than regulation, in a world with uncertainty, learning, and economies of scale. And we switched as a world from leaded to unleaded petrol, largely through regulation. We could have had a price for lead. You know, this is what it costs. Going to cost you to pour lead into children's brains. That would have been one way of doing it. But we felt politically it was better to do it that way. But also economically, the clarity of clear deadlines allows people to invest with confidence in technical change and doing things differently. So there's the incandescent light bulb, which has largely been banned in Europe. And the arrival of the LED lighting, which is transforming lighting, cutting emissions and energy use by a factor of around 10, was really accelerated by that action. Good economics. It's not violating some rule. It's about clarity, economies of scale, and so on. So it depends where you look. I mean, I think the instinct to start with prices is basically a good one, but we shouldn't be blanket in saying that. Education, persuasion. We're not very good at it. I mean, we lost the Brexit. You know what side I was on. We lost the Brexit story because we didn't articulate. There's a collection of reasons. I don't want to oversimplify, but one feature of that was poor communication. The Brexit argument ran: are you happy with your lot? No. Do you like foreigners, immigrants taking your jobs? No. And do you like other countries telling you what to do? No. So vote leave. It's 10 seconds, right? And the only thing we had that was remotely close to that was you're much more likely to be treated by an immigrant than be behind an immigrant in the queue. Now, basically, we didn't do very well. What the challenge is to find ways of communicating that are snappy and right. Now, my father would never have dreamt his son would praise a pope, but this The Pope is very good at that. If we destroy creation, creation will destroy us. God always forgives, people sometimes forgive, nature never forgives. Now you can logic chop about, what's this creation? But basically those arguments are right. So what you have to do is to get much better at that kind of communication. Probably he's doing more on YouTube or whatever. That's not my skill. But we have to think about that, and we've not done very well. Business, faith, and security services are a big part of that story. Business has been doing an increasingly good job in explaining why it matters, explaining what they can do, showing themselves to be responsible, and doing well by that. Faith leaders, I've already mentioned the Pope, and the security service and the military are pretty good on this too. And I don't know how to communicate with this current White House, but I wouldn't mind betting that business, faith, and security might be a way of doing it, brackets plus family. So we have to think hard. It's a very important question. And finally, I want to conclude, this really is the growth story. I mean, infrastructure, if done well, you can always mess things up, but infrastructure, investment now, sustainable infrastructure. Mr. President, surely you'd want the infrastructure to be smart, clean, modern, and robust. It beats dumb, dirty, old-fashioned, and fragile, surely. So that infrastructure story is a big one, and it's shorter to medium term. In a medium term, we set off a Schumpeterian story of discovery and innovation, which will be a real driver in technical change. And we've seen that in waves of technological change in history. And finally, there isn't a high-carbon, long-run growth story because it creates an environment so hostile that it undermines itself. So this is the growth story if we do it well, if we think it through, if we are smart about policies, infrastructure, and so on. And that, I think, was in a large measure what drove the Paris Agreement. And we have to show now that we really can deliver on that story.
Thank you, Nick. Well, let's give a round of applause to our panelists.